I'm 35, you're 26. I have a PhD, you've got a master's. I've got this much experience, you've got that much experience. Those things matter, right? Like, to be aware of that matters. It's not just I have knowledge and you have knowledge and we're just equal. That's the lie. These dynamics matter. We have to be aware of them. We have to be aware that we're not just, and so there comes certain responsibility with that. And I think that the responsibility is that we have to increasingly humanize ourselves to the singularity of each particular relationship.
I'm Paul, founder of Maniphesto. MMA is our weekly intellectual deep dive, and this video is recorded live during one of our community meetings. If you enjoy it, then please make sure you subscribe here and check out our website if you'd like to join in the discussion on one of our community meetings, which are held every Wednesday.
Welcome, Cadell. We've just come from yesterday where we were stirring up controversy over on the Stoa. And
Dunking.
Yes, dunking and riling up the rabble and all of that. But yeah, Cadell, what was academia like for you in the last few years before you left?
Okay. Well, first I would say I had a very strange academic experience and a very strange academic opportunity. So my background, long story short, is that I failed high school. I went to a community college for 2 years to make up for credits that would help me get into university. That community college was kind of like a general exposure to almost every subject. I then I excelled. I went into McMaster University. I was interested in humans, so I studied anthropology and history for 4 years. I did well. I went then to University of Toronto for graduate school to study lemurs. I did not want to study lemurs. I was studying lemurs because the University of Toronto was the best grad school program for anthropology, and I wanted to get my foot in the door. And then for my PhD, I knew that I was not going to make any compromises with my topic. I wanted to do my PhD in a topic that I was really passionate about. I was just sacrificing to do the master's just to sort of, as I say, get my foot in the door. In any case, the McMaster University of Toronto situation was very formal academia. What I would say is like your normative university programs, your normative grad school programs. And in that sense, I have a very deep experience with sort of like what the university structure is like. However, for my PhD, I got a weird situation to explore the topic of transhumanism, basically, at a weird institute called the Global Brain Institute in Brussels. And that just came from me blogging about my own stuff. And I just sent my stuff to whatever transhumanists would look at it. And my PhD supervisor became Francis Heiligen, who basically had gotten startup money from Yuri Milner, who's a billionaire who gives, millions of dollars to different intellectuals that he thinks are interesting. And Francis decided to hire me for a 4-year PhD program, and the program was very esoteric. I was basically able to kind of explore and do whatever I wanted for 4 years within the parameters of the idea of the global brain singularity, which became my thesis. That's basically my history, and how I experienced my doctoral program was very probably unlike, I would say it was very much unlike what your typical doctoral program would be like, because like I say, the program I was in was kind of very esoteric and obscure on the condition that it was being funded by some billionaire outside of the university system. So in that sense, I kind of snuck through a crack. because like I could get out of all the I could get out of all the bureaucratic cobwebs of a formal academic system through this weird funding situation. That's sort of like a Cole's note. So.
Yeah, and
history.
So when you finished the PhD, how come you ended up being a YouTuber as opposed to being a postgrad?
Okay, so the reason for that was basically a crisis of sublimation. So while I was doing my PhD for about 3 years, I basically went into pure withdrawal. By pure withdrawal, I mean I was just in pure self-study and pure inward reflection and pure just trying to read everything I could. And that was my plan for the first 3 years of my PhD anyway. And then when I found out, when I sort of felt I had something to say, I felt like the university couldn't contain me. I felt like my energy was too much. There wasn't really I didn't feel like there was a space for me. Like there was like, you know, like you go to a conference and you'd get like a 15-minute presentation. Or I would like in my own institute, we would have a little conference series and I would get like 1 hour. And I was just like, that's not enough time. I have way more things to say and I have way more things to create and I have way more things to contribute than the university seems to be able to contain. And the university views my excess as problematic, meaning like they just want me to fit inside this 15-minute time slot, or they just want me to fit inside this 1 hour conference time slot, and then to go back to myself, I guess. And I felt like I had much more to contribute and I had much more to say. So I basically needed to find a new outlet. And that is what basically my YouTube channel became. And that YouTube channel was originally a pop science channel that I did with my best friend before I started my PhD. And then I stopped doing that pop science channel when I started my PhD. So the channel was actually dormant for 3 years. And then I started it back up again, doing the philosophy stuff when I felt like I had sort of transformed my identity fundamentally. Because when I started the pop science stuff, I was basically doing like pop human evolution stuff. And then when I went into sort of that 3-year withdrawal during my PhD funding, I basically went deeper into philosophy and felt like I wanted to transform sort of the brand image of the channel as well, and sort of felt like I had a totally different aspect of my thinking to offer. And I didn't want to go the pop direction. I didn't want to go in the direction of pleasing algorithms. I wanted to go in the direction of creating something that I felt would be basically like, I always say, like, I try to make my work increasingly timeless, which is not necessarily going to please the algorithms. Like, it's not like a school of life philosophy program where like you get like a 5-minute clip on a certain philosopher. I wanted to produce 1 hour long deep meditations on the best books that I felt I could find. And I wanted to offer that for free. And basically what I think the consequence of that is that I basically have my own little university on my channel. Like all of those playlists to me are like grad level discourses, which could be the material for, you know, its own grad school program, which is basically what I'm trying to do now with Philosophy Portal.
I remember there's something that I've spoken to you about like kind of multiple times, and you were talking about it at the EMG last year, which is to do with, I guess maybe some of your kind of criticisms or seeing the gaps in the actual way that the academic structure and its thinking was relating to the questions of like what it is to be a human. So you've written your book, Sex, Masculinity, and God, which is, well, I'm obviously interested in masculinity. I remember one of the phrases from that presentation you gave on it was that you're in a department supposedly studying embodied cognition, and it was a bunch of people who just weren't embodied at all. It's like a bunch of eggheads. It's a department that says evolution is fundamentally what has driven the emergence of biological life, and yet at the same time completely denies the importance and the relevance of sexual difference in any of the actual dynamics that exist today, say in power structures, indeed in the university itself. Have you got any kind of like thoughts or just riffs to expand on that?
Yeah, so I would say like this is one of like this is I guess like I mean I'm always learning about myself when I like reflect on like what I'm presenting on or what I create like after the fact. And like one of the things that I'm learning about my own thinking is the importance of the self-referential paradox, and the way in which the self-referential paradox appears in many university discourses. And at least, you know, in reference to what you're talking about with sex, masculinity, and God, I was in a department that was titled Evolution, Cognition, and Complexity. So basically, what I did to write Sex, Masculinity, and God was basically pull out all of the things from this department which I felt were paradoxically either unrecognized or unacknowledged or sort of resulting in paradoxes of embodiment. So like, for example, yeah, we study evolution, but we don't pay attention to sexual difference in our actual environment. We study cognition, but we're not interested in the difference between, say, masculine cognition and feminine cognition. We study complexity, but we're not aware of the way in which basically theological problems related to notion of the absolute or notions of God are impacting sort of the development of theoretical activity. So all of these things sort of like, I mean, so you can now, in all fairness to the complexity of the world, and like, I'm not necessarily like the easiest person sometimes to, you know, I could imagine my PhD, like my PhD supervisor was relieved in some sense when I finished my PhD, for example. Like in all fairness to that, like, you know, I was poking holes, right? And I think that's what young people should do, is try to poke holes and find where, you know, thinking is not working properly, or where there's gaps where new thought can emerge. So that's basically what I was doing. And you could imagine, again, like my PhD supervisor was like, you know, like kind of like, oh shit, like
yeah.
Like, you know, this guy's poking holes in my work.
I like what you kind of bring in around that self-referential paradox, and maybe that's something that we can expand upon a little bit more to kind of understand what it means. But what it kind of gets me thinking of is, if I reflect on my time as an undergrad and then a master's student, and I was studying literature, classical literature, so ancient Greek and ancient Roman texts. And if I'm honest, if I look back on why I went into that, I think fundamentally I was trying to find answers to questions of my own suffering, essentially. And in school, I was always a sciences kid, but I was also studying Latin. And I kind of had this sense of, actually, studying physics is not gonna give me insight into myself, whereas going and studying Latin poetry might. So I went and did that. And a lot of the program was just kind of going through the motions, but there were a few topics, especially when we got into philosophical territory, that kind of vibed with me. And then when I did the master's, I really wanted to go into, I'd kind of discovered psychoanalysis and Zizek and Lacan, and I wanted to go into their thought. But what I came up against in this in the literature department was the way in which I think psychoanalysis had basically just been turned into a tool for academic grifters to write a funny paper or on a text that no one's actually going to read except a couple of their poor students. And it just becomes a very almost self-indulgent exercise. And that's what I ended up feeling like my master's program was. And there were a lot of people around me kind of clapping and going, oh yes, this is exciting. Someone in our department is writing about Zizek and the classics, but no one really knew what the fuck I was doing. I didn't really know what the fuck I was doing. I almost kind of had this feeling of like, this is all a big fake. I'm literally here in a master's program in a literature department at Bristol University. Maybe I'm going to get in trouble if someone sees that, but oh well. We're going to kill you guys, right? MMA, online education. It's a controversial week, eh? But no, my point being that there was something both, like, even there, like, I moved up towards trying to think philosophy and psychoanalysis, but it wasn't really being taught how to think about myself with it. I was just doing these kind of Frankenstein's monsters reading of texts. And then at the same time, this was the same year that the whole Jordan Peterson thing happened. And so I think some of you guys have heard me talking about this before. All of a sudden, there was at the same time this whole podcasting, YouTube boom happening of intellectuals applying questions of mythology and psychology to really deep existential thinking, and kind of doing that thing that Peterson did of blending, I guess, personal growth and development with intellectual thought. And so it was a very strange place to kind of see both of these happening side by side and being like, wow, this internet thing feels more alive than this university structure that I'm in.
Yeah, I felt like in like my own sort of I had my own experience of sort of that cultural constellation, let's say, that you're describing, just from a different location, and a different place in my development, I suppose. But I had the same feeling that the university structure was kind of, I realized how frustrated I was because the university structure wasn't holding the potential of my energy, and the internet might. Like, the internet was an outlet. It was just like, again, I think like the best way for me to think about it is that it was an outlet for sublimation, and that what we're doing online, stumbling and falling and making mistakes along the way, is we are trying to build out new structures which are better suited to the dynamics of our actual consciousness and what we can actually provide and how we can actually interact. I mean, there are new conditions of possibility for action. There are new conditions of possibility for thought. There are new conditions of possibility for how we can organize. I mean, this literally was not possible 10 years ago. So I think that's, and at the same time, the institutions as they are right now don't hold our energy like they would have certainly decades ago.
And it's interesting in that lens to perhaps think about what historical function education, and particularly higher education, universities have fulfilled, because I guess you could perhaps trace the emergence of the university to the medieval monasteries, and perhaps even before that, like the great libraries of the ancient world, places set up to kind of really scholarly, whatever, study, well, originally, I guess, the religious texts and the ancient texts, and then gradually emerging essentially into a kind of finishing school for teaching members of the ruling class how to be effective members of the ruling class. And then, as far as I understand it, slowly the kind of educational franchise, if you will, rolled out across the social body in perhaps the last couple of 100 years, to the extent that the academic career path has become a thing that certain people go down. But then also beyond that, higher education has kind of become your ticket into the middle class, your ticket into the bourgeoisie. In order to get many jobs, you need to have that tick by your name that says you went here.
I think that was post-World War II.
Okay.
I think that narrative emerged post-World War II and became something that was like sort of mapping reality during the last half of the 20th century. But I think the problem is now that narrative just does not map. Like, that's not your ticket into the middle class anymore. Like, just because, like, if you have a university degree or even a master's degree or even a PhD at this point, that doesn't guarantee you anything. Not anymore.
Well, precisely. And I think that kind of a large part of the rollout was to do with the desire for more technology capable people to be involved in the big economies that were growing in the 20th century and also be involved with the Cold War. But the kind of historical moment has shifted pretty drastically. It's like, yes, there is still, go on, you sound like you got something to say there.
No, well, just saying, I think it, at least for someone like me, it makes it sort of like, the reason why I can do what I'm doing online is because my motive in the university was never to, like, I didn't go to university to try and get into the middle class or try to get a well-paying job. I went into university because I had some sort of truth search was at stake. And then that translates into what I'm doing now, because it's not like I'm not making lots of money. So it's not my aim. So what I'm doing translates in that regard. But I think for a lot of people are disillusioned with the university structure because actually their motive was to make was to make money. Like, their thing was like, I thought I was going to get into the middle class by doing this. I'm not in the middle class. So I think that's hurting. I think people are freaking out about that. Like, they don't know how to sort of get that sort of stable position in the economy.
Yeah. It's not guaranteed, and that perhaps that even that pool of jobs has shrunk somewhat at the same time as the number of people coming out expecting to get into it has grown. I mean, that certainly seems to be what I kind of hear from people on the ground, that there's just so many unpaid internships for graduates, or people like being offered 2 days a week work in a research department.
Yeah, there's some absurd examples. I mean, I think like what I see is that almost every sector is being affected by sort of a major transformation of expectations for long-term identity, because people thought, like, people in the 20th century could basically form a long-term identity in it with one job and a reasonable income, say like that they could buy a house and they could like go on vacation once a year and they could support their kids and stuff like that. And all of that seems to be breaking down. I'm definitely not an expert on it, but that's like what I observe, and like that's what I see in the sort of the culture, is that, I mean, there is an older generation that has a lot of stability. That generation sort of seems to be increasingly of little practical utility. They're kind of like holding on to like whatever resources and power they have left. And then there's like a whole generation coming up that basically has the anxiety of an unstable identity future because they thought they would find it in a career. And that doesn't seem to be, I don't think that's the way the future is going to unfold. Identity is going to be a lot different in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century, at the last half of the 20th century. I mean, and before that, I mean, people's identities in the agricultural, like most people were in some sort of agricultural mode of life, which also provided some sort of lifelong identity, but also very, very different than obviously the 21st century.
You know, I think here I'd like to just pivot a little bit and maybe talk for 10 minutes or so about teachers and student relationships, which is something that's also kind of very relevant to our discussions in our communities at the moment. And then perhaps after that, we can actually just open up and ask you guys if you've got any questions or thoughts or stories to share, just start bringing them in. But yeah, like, well, obviously we've just done our month on Girard, and one of the things we've discussed is the relationships between models and obstacles, and the way in which, say, if I've got a desire to be better at, well, I mean, I can even use my relationship with you, Cadell. Like, you are an older figure who holds some kind of like teacherly authority relative to me, say, in the domain of philosophy. And so me desiring to learn philosophy, I kind of approach you as a friend, but also as, in some sense, a student. And there's a kind of healthy dynamic in that relationship where you can kind of show me the ropes and give me some advice and help me develop my thinking. But there are also unhealthy dynamics that can emerge, like, for example, Girard's metaphysical desire, where I cease to desire our common shared object of philosophy, but actually just desire the being of you yourself. So this sense of like, I want philosophy, and Cadell embodies philosophy. So I want to be Cadell. And then obviously I'm not Cadell. And I wind up in this horrible position of wanting to, on the one hand, become Cadell. And then on the other hand, kind of wanting to kill Cadell and rebel against Cadell because he is everything I want to be. And I'm kind of structured around this impossibility of being you. And I think this has kind of come up in certain relationships we've seen in the last week or two. And it's relevant to me because I know that I do have teacherly or studently relationships with many kind of older figures in this online space. And to the extent that culture is going to move into an online world, and intergenerational relationships are going to form in an online world where we aren't meeting each other face to face regularly. We're kind of talking heads on a screen. It's easy to project onto people, and even to feel like you know people better than you do. So like, for example, I remember in my early days of getting into this podcasting scene, I listened to hours and hours and hours of Andrew Sweeney and Alexander Bard, two people I didn't know very well, but I'd listened to hours and hours of talking to them. And so then meeting them, it kind of feels like, oh, I know you, but of course I don't know you. I've just got an idea of who you are and how you're going to help me up in this world, help me towards this object that I want, which is, I guess, philosophy. And I guess the question is how to navigate these dynamics skillfully, how to be a skillful teacher, how to be a skillful student. And what are your thoughts on this?
I think this is so important to think. Like, the crucial thing, like, I could go into, we could take it many directions. The crucial thing, and I think the most general thing for everyone here to reflect on, is the reality of what psychoanalysis calls transference relationship. You can look that up online if you want to look up online transference, but transference is basically some sort of intimate, affective relationship where you can project, like, basically your unconscious projects onto the teacher the emotions that your infantile mind would have projected onto your father or your mother when you were growing up. So you think you're interacting with the person that's in front of you as sort of the person, like, as you are now, but really what's going on is you're projecting on a lot of infantile needs and desires onto the other person that are still basically unconscious to you. So you can start basically you can basically start acting out dynamics with a teacher like you were doing with your father when you were 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years old. And I think that the crucial thing is that we need teacher-student relationships. The thing is that we can't avoid transference relationships. It's not like transference relationships are a bad thing. It's that we need to become aware that when we're in a teacher-student relationship, these dynamics are going to take place. So I have to be aware, and it's also like uncomfortable to bring it up, especially when it's like getting close to the actual transference relationship itself. So like between you and me, Owen, like as soon, like when I'm talking in generalities, it's like, oh, I can talk about this, no problem. Transference relationship, here's the technical definitions, blah, blah, blah. And then as soon as we get to like me and you, Owen, then like you can start to feel like the resistance inside yourself to like talking about where the transference dynamic, how the transference dynamics are taking place. But becoming more aware of the transference dynamics is the key to handling them properly. So like, for example, as someone I have to, and this was like a big thing that I had a problem with my PhD supervisor, is that he wasn't willing to be aware of the transference dynamic relationship. So for example, I'm 35, you're 26. I have a PhD, you've got a master's. I've got this much experience, you've got that much experience. Those things matter, right? Like to be aware of that matters. It's not just I have knowledge and you have knowledge and we're just equal. that's the lie. That's the lie. Like, so basically you have to be aware, like, I'm talking to someone who's 20 years older than me. I'm talking to someone who has 20 years more experience than me. I'm talking to someone who has this much power, this much authority, this much, these dynamics matter. We have to be aware of them. We have to be aware that we're not just, and so there comes certain responsibility with that. And I think that the responsibility is that we have to increasingly humanize ourselves to the singularity of each particular relationship. Like, I have to be hyper aware. I'm talking to Owen right now. I'm not talking to Andrew right now. Or I'm talking, like, there's a whole bunch of other people. I'm talking to this person, not this person. I have to be aware of my history with this person. I have to be aware of how this person sees me. I have to be aware of how I want to be seen to that. You just have to become more aware of all of the singularities of the relationship. So this, I think, means, to very quickly summarize, and then would be something that's come up in the Philosophy of Lack series, is the relationship between explanation and address. So oftentimes when we become bureaucratic identities or in professional identities, we become these machines of explanation. But what we lose with that is that we lose addressing an individual person. So I think, like, the practice to take on transference relationships fully is to realize that we're couching every explanation in addressing the person that we're talking to, and all of the developmental and emotional dynamics that come along with that address.
Great. And I guess just like a final thought that occurs to me before I sling it open, it's like, one of the things it seems like the internet world is doing is totally dissolving the distinction between professional and private life.
Yeah.
So where previously, if we would have had, say, the relationship we have, it would have been within the context of an academic department.
Exactly. I would have been like a grad school teacher. I would have been, and the thing is we underestimate how weird it is, because I remember when I was in middle school, the whole concept of me being friends with a teacher online was very taboo. Like, this is it's very weird from 15 years ago.
Right. And now we kind of almost take it for granted that we just meet up in the evenings and drop messenger chats to each other all day long and kind of have ongoing email threads with tens, hundreds of people there. And it's like, it's very fluid, but it also totally makes invisible, like you were saying, the differentiations and the actual kind of natural hierarchies of status, of ability, and so forth, and age and authority.
And it's uncomfortable to think them. So, like, for example, if it's just naturally in place that the institution has, I'm in this position, you're in that position, it's always kind of unspoken, basically like an implicit background, then you don't have to think them. But as soon as you start to think them deeply, it's actually like quite unsettling and uncomfortable. Like, you can notice like the affect level changes. Like, as soon as like I have to like sort of like, for example, when I'm collaborating with Bard, like I have to recognize so many things, and he has to recognize so many things that are actually effectively disturbing, but also the source of immense growth. And also the source of deeper relationality, I would say, than when you have just the bureaucratic identities interacting with each other in a kind of sterile, neutered way.
Brilliant.
So big challenges, huge challenges, mostly challenges for emotional intelligence, but also challenges for a deeper form of relationality. Like, I think like, to be concrete, I think the relationships I built with you and Frege, with Technosocial, or like, other guys that I collaborate with, like the Sex Masculinity God guys, like I could explain like that whole project as sort of me attempting to push deep relationality or explore deep relationality in a different way than I was experiencing among bureaucratic identities or professional identities. And they come with new challenges, but I much prefer these relationships than than the professional, say, bureaucratic relationships, even inclusive of the challenges that they present.